Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this meeting of the BCP Council Audit and Governance Committee. We'll begin the agenda. Item 1, apologies. Mr. Hanton.
There's no apologies, Chairman.
And item 2, substitute members. I don't think there are any. No. Item 3, declarations of interest. Any members have declarations they wish to make? Vice Chairman?
Yes, I'm a member of the Russell Coates Management Committee.
Thank you very much. Item 4 is confirmation of minutes. That is the minutes of the last meeting on the 19th of December. First of all, are you content that those are a true and accurate record of that meeting? All those agreed, please indicate. I think that is unanimous. I will therefore sign them.
I wasn't at the meeting.
No, indeed.
No.
Unanimous by those who were present at the meeting. I don't see any matters arising that we should be considering at this meeting that are not necessarily on the agenda already. Are you agreed? Thank you very much. Item 5 is public issues. Mr. Hanton.
We've had no questions or statements, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Members, we've got, I think, quite a substantial agenda to get through this evening. It would be my intention to try to ensure that we don't exceed the normal 2 hours for this meeting if we possibly can. But I, of course, am in your hands entirely, and I do appreciate that there is an item later on the agenda, item 12, on the Constitution, which may take a little time. I would ask you, though, please, if you could be measured as we go through the agenda, because I wouldn't want to find that we get to such a late hour that we can't consider that item properly. So it is up to you as members. I don't want to stifle proper debate, but at the same time it would be good if we can get through this with as much attention on each item as we go through the agenda without rushing those later on. Councillor Cox.
Just as a matter of probity, should we not bring forward possibly the last item on the agenda to the beginning so that the erstwhile auditor can go home?
We did consider that earlier at the agenda briefing, but we felt that it was probably good, given that everybody had the agenda already, if we stuck to the order that we have, considering officers and the public in particular. So we did consider it, and I think the consensus was that we should leave it as it was. So that takes us on to item 6 on the agenda, which is the annual governance statement and the action plan update. And I think, Mr. Stannard, you're going to introduce this item.
Thank you, Chairman. So this is the annual half-year update of the action plan. In this case, it's the action plan inherited by BCP on the governance issues that existed in legacy councils. And just as a recap, information governance was a issue on the governance statements of legacy Bournemouth and Poole, respectively, and the governance issues surrounding the off-day inspection was on the legacy Bournemouth side of things. So this paper seeks to allow Audit and Governance Committee to consider the arrangements that have been put in place through the year so far, and importantly, not to duplicate the work of, for example, the Overview and Scrutiny Committee on the Ofsted side of things, but to have an assurance that the governance arrangements in place to tackle the issues are robust. And the table on page 12 and 13 and 14 of our agenda attempts to do that. So conscious of what you said at the start, Chair, so I think that's a useful introduction, hopefully, and if you ask members to pose any questions they would like to ask.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. members. Councillor Cox.
Just a quickie. Can you just say who the members of the Information Governance Board are?
Yeah, they are effectively principally tiers 2 and 3 within the organisation, so corporate directors and service directors supported by team managers where there are specific data sets that are operated. It depends really where the data sets are being held and operated on a day-to-day basis within the organisation. But the board is corporate directors and service directors.
Well, if there are no further questions for Mr. Stannard, this report is for noting, and I think we're all content by the sound of it if we duly note it. Agreed? Thank you very much indeed. Takes us on to item 7 on the agenda, which is the Treasury Management Monitoring Report. And I think Mr. Filmer is going to present this. Is that correct, Mr. Richards?
Yeah.
So, Mr. Filmer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the Treasury Management update to the end of December 2019, as well as the Treasury Management Strategy for 2021. I'll try and keep it quite brief. I won't go over a full economic update as in December, but I think most of us are aware there was a general election. Brexit's still quite a draw on the UK economy, and the global economy is still very slow with the ongoing trade war between the US and China. What isn't mentioned in the report is the latest CPI inflation for December, which dropped from 1.5% to 1.3%. So at the moment, the markets are factoring in a rate cut next week of a 75% chance of that happening. So whether or not we see the Monetary Policy Committee knee-jerk to that latest inflation figures, we'll see. But interest rates could fall, which is good news for the Council because we have quite a big borrowing requirement. I also mentioned in the report about the PWB, which is the Public Works Loan Board. They're part of the Treasury and where local authorities go to borrow. In October last year, they increased the interest rate by 1% overnight with no warning. So although we might see the bank rate reduce, we still got to contend with the higher PWB rate. Moving on to Table 1 of the report, it just sets out the Treasury Management performance. Table 2 of the report. And we're forecasting 110 favourable forecasts, which is all to do with investment income. We've had higher cash balances than we expected coming into BCP Council. And Table 3 and 4 just sets out the Council's borrowing and investments as at the end of December, but I won't go through that in any detail because there hasn't been any material change since the last quarter. I'll move on to the Treasury Management Strategy for 2021, which is the Appendix 1 to this report. It's a requirement for every council to do a Treasury Management Strategy for the following year, and it's to be approved by this committee. The Treasury Management Strategy sets out how the council invests its cash, so who it invests that money with and for how long. It sets out who we can borrow money from and the limits on that amount of borrowing. It also sets out the council's capital programme and how we plan to fund that over the next 3 years and how that's in relation to borrowing. And lastly, we have to set out a minimum revenue provision policy, which is fairly technical, but put simply, it's the amount of revenue we have to set aside to pay off the council's debt, be it internal or external. So I won't go through the Treasury Management Strategy in detail, I'll just highlight the changes which are set out from paragraph 25 of the report. They are fairly technical, but I'll try and keep it straightforward. So the first point, the Treasury Management Strategy, the numbers included in the report now include an element of the disaggregation of Dorset County Council's balance sheet in relation to Christchurch. It's nearly finalised, those figures, but it's roughly around 23 to 24 million in terms of debt that the council will be taking on, with a sort of net cash transfer of around 20 million once we take into cash balances. The next point is a change in the accounting code of practices for local authorities from 21-22. So we have to include all leases, bar some exceptions, on the council's balance sheet. So some leases at the moment are treated as revenue. They'll be all put onto the balance sheet. That will increase the council's liabilities. In turn, will increase the council's capital financing requirement. And that is a level of effectively council's unfunded capital expenditure. The borrowing, put simply, that we haven't yet to pay off. So the figures in the treasury management strategy now include an element of leases, but there's still a whole-scale review of leases to be carried out for the 21-22 accounts. Next point is in relation to the minimum revenue policy that I just referred to. So at the moment, the council charges a 4% MRP on any capital programmes that are under 10 million. Anything over 10 million, we choose to do an asset base. So it could be 50 years, so we'll do it on a 2% basis. What we'd like to do is just extend the flexibility of that MRP policy so that it'll be for the Section 151 officer to determine what would be strategically important for the council, and then we could choose to take an asset life basis rather than a flat 4%. Basically to make it more affordable. The next point, and again referring to what I mentioned earlier about the PWB increasing the interest rates overnight, it's just opening up different sources of borrowing. So we don't want to limit ourselves to the Public Works Loan Board. We want to be able to access other borrowing, which might be cheaper, so in the long run better for the council. And the last change is we've now included some reference to ethical investments, which are becoming more mainstream. There's more products from financial institutions and growing interest from councils to invest in those type of products. But it's important that any of those investments still meet the treasury management strategy in terms of our core principles. And realistically, the council actually isn't in a position to invest for any long periods of time at the moment. So it's probably something to consider and evolve over the course. So I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Filmer. Questions? Councillor Cox?
Can you tell me who, sorry, put it down somewhere. Lost track of it now. There's a name of it. Oakdale Capital Scheme. What's the Oakdale Capital Scheme? It's mentioned in the report.
Just to give you an update, in one of the predecessor councils, Poole, had a scheme to look at there's an adult learning centre in Oakdale area of Poole, and potentially look at changing that into a potential housing scheme or potential partial scheme between housing and a new adult learning centre, and that's the reference within the report is to that scheme.
Okay, so how does that affect Treasury? Because it
affects
the MRP, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's the fact that actually what we've done is historically in Poole we made we had some flexibility within our MRP policy, i.e. voluntary revenue provision, and we had the opportunity to redirect that towards that scheme, and that's what we did. We used that flexibility to help support that capital scheme.
Okay.
Councillor Bartlett?
No, not finished, but you can. No, you can. No.
I was looking in your direction,
No,
expecting you to indicate you wanted to speak
Yes,
again.
sorry.
Right, I'll come back to you. Councillor Cox.
In terms of the authorised debt limit, where does that come from? Who decides what the authorised debt limit is?
It's something we decide internally, and something we have to judge whether it's going to be affordable. So we're not going to set a limit if we can pay that debt off. So it's something we review whether the revenue budget could take on any further debt.
But who makes that decision?
It would be between Section 151 officer and myself to determine that.
Okay. No, that's okay. That's fine.
Councillor Bartlett.
Thank you, Chair. In paragraph 4 on page 27, it talks about the capital strategy. It's being reported separately. Can you give us any idea when that will be reported?
I believe it's going in March, that report, as part of was it part of the budget report, I believe?
If I can potentially come in, if the reference is to the capital investment programme, which that's part of the budget report that will be at Cabinet on the 12th of February and Council on the 18th of February, if it's the more commercial aspect, which is the non-treasury capital investment strategy, that one I think is on Cabinet agenda for March.
Councillor Cox.
I'm kind of aware that there's a lot of new products out there in terms of borrowing where councils can borrow. Is that what you're trying to do to incorporate some of those products? And do you want to just explain what those are?
Yeah, so there's lots of products that we have actually accessed already. So we've already organised a forward loan from a pension fund, which is going to come in July 2021. So we basically fixed the rate about 3 years ago, and that money will come in at that rate. It's mainly pension funds that are offering this alternative to the PWLB. But we've also seen, they're just about to issue the first municipal bond, which was an initiative to try and beat the PWLB rate. And I forget which councils signed up to it. The only issue with the municipal bond agency is they're quite short-term bonds. They're only up to about 7 years. So it wouldn't be something perhaps the council would consider at this point. But if it's successful and they increase the maturity, it'd be something we'd look at.
And it's really just to do with the borrowing and in terms of the political input into it, because there's obviously no political input at all. And should there not be some sort of political input, I don't particularly mean the Cabinet, I mean the Council, in terms of if they wanted to do something, create a new tram system, for instance, then maybe we should have an input into what that authorised limit should be.
Could I ask Mr. Richards to comment on that?
Well, I suppose this report sets out your potential indicators, but with regards to input into any major capital schemes, where they're financed by potential borrowing, then it has to be a council decision. And as part of that council decision, you have to present a business case. And that business case would have to outline the borrowing arrangements. And in circumstances where it would trigger our potential caps and thresholds we put in here, then we'd have to bring it back to Audit Committee to get that input as part of that process.
Councillor Bartlett.
Thank you, just a quick one. On paragraph 38, it talks about Bournemouth Council secured a £49 million forward loan. I understand what that was for. I just don't understand the terminology of the forward. Is this another loan that's now superseded an initial borrowing?
Mr. Filmer?
No, it's some. I just mentioned it just a minute ago. So the Bournemouth Borough Council secured a loan at a certain rate 3 years ago, and that rate basically carries forward to July 2021. Right. It's when we take out borrowing, it's for cash purposes. It's not for anything specific. Just pick up on what Adam referred to on potential borrowing. When we look at a scheme and choose to fund it from potential borrowing, that's one thing. But how we fund that, be it from cash, be it from internal resources or externally, that's a different matter. Mm-hmm. And that's effectively what that is as part of the ongoing cash management, the longer term plans of the council.
If there are no further questions, we've got two recommendations on this report. The first one is to note the activity on Treasury management. So I assume we're all content to note. Thank you. And the second is to approve the Treasury management strategy for 2021 at Appendix 1. We've had a number of questions, and I think there haven't been any adverse comments made. So if we could go to the second recommendation, I think we'll take a vote on the approval of the Treasury Management Strategy. All those in favour, please indicate. And there are none against, so that is unanimous. Thank you, members. Takes us on to agenda item 8 on the agenda, which is the assurance framework and internal audit planning consultation. That's you, Mr. Stannard, to present.
Thank you, Chair. So yes, this report consults Audit and Governance Committee on the planned internal audit approach at quite high level for next financial year. This is not only good practice, of course, but it's actually a requirement of the public sector internal audit standards. So the three key sections of the report are the agreement of the assurance framework, which is the appendix. We've used the old adage that picture paints 1,000 words, so it's a reasonably crude picture of all the assurance sources that the council obtains. It's a fairly generic picture that a lot of local authorities use. Certainly the legacy councils use this. It's not a radical thing by any means. The second part of the paper talks about the high-level internal audit resource, and there's a table on pages 53 and 54 respectively. You'll see that the bottom line on that table is the same level of internal audit resource. That's obviously an indication that the resource this year is the same as next year. And there's been some subtle changes that we're proposing, realignment of resources, mainly in the section that you'll see around VFM, efficiency, the MTFP, and BCP implementation work. And you might think that's a bit strange, but the 15 reduction from 45 to 30 on VFM, that's a reflection of the Chief Executive's work on the base budget reviews, and the less requirement for internal audit to be involved in those. There's a lot of accountancy involvement in those, so we just reined back a bit on that. And the BCP implementation, of course, there's still lots to do on BCP implementation. However, this is a bit more of a categorisation error on my part in the previous year, where it's internal audit redesigning itself for BCP. So what we've done there is we've moved that resource from BCP implementation to service management a little bit further down in the table to demonstrate that that's redesigning internal audit and our approach. And an example of that is where we are clustering as auditors and hitting service areas in a very short time frame. So we've got good feedback on that we're in and out in a week / 2 weeks, rather than, picking off pieces of work over a longer period. And that approach seems to be much favoured by a lot of services. The third and final element of the report is around compliance with the standards. And we've got a semi-thorny issue around the external verification, external assessment of internal audits work. So for full and technical compliance with public sector internal audit standards, internal audit should be inspected every 5 years. And the legacy councils haven't done that because of the cost prohibitive nature of that in the past, and they've pragmatically said, well, we know we've got assurance on our internal audit work because we as a committee look at internal audit. For example, the fees that were being quoted, historically were around £12,000 to £15,000 for that external assurance piece. But now they're coming in at around £3,000 from SIPFA. So I'm thinking that that's more realistic, and to get an external assessment of the internal audit team. So, but you may think differently. So I'm asking, do you think that's a good idea, or do you think we should carry on with the legacy council's approach and not have technical full compliance? Questions, please.
Whilst you're on that subject, Mr. Stannard, if you could just clarify, because the original figures of 12 to 15,000 were per council previously. We're now looking at BCP as one council, bringing that down to 3,000, and that's the issue around recommendation 3 in the report.
Correct.
So there is a very, very substantial change now that we are one council rather than 3. Questions? Councillor Cox.
Nigel, the number of days is kept the same, and I don't know. I suppose I was expecting there to be some sort of saving because of the merger of the 3 councils that you'd effectively not need quite as much as you did last year. So that was one question. But linked to that is I was going to ask about staffing. How's your staffing? Because I appreciate there's a shortage of auditors. That's one question. Do you want me to carry on?
We'll deal with them one at a time, I think, Spare. Mr. Stannard.
Yeah. So the first question with regard to potential savings. So the 1920 figures is obviously the first year of BCP Council, and we've already saved 22% from the legacy council aggregate position in terms of internal audit staffing and overall resource. So the first year of BCP is 1920, and therefore, in effect, we've already taken the savings out of that first figure. Second part of
I'm just asking about how the fact that you've maintained the same staffing is that qualified auditors, or are you having to take lower grade auditors, or?
Yeah, we've got. I think we've got about the exact figure. I think it's 13.2 FTs. I can clarify that outside the meeting if needs be. And there are 7 qualified auditors of the 13.2. And in terms of turnover, we've had 1 turnover this year, and we've been able to recruit. We haven't seen a problem.
And the next one was just to comment on your assessment of whether you need to spend £3,000 on having somebody check what you're doing. My own personal opinion is £3,000 won't give you a day almost. So I thought it was a complete waste of money because it won't tell you anything. £3,000. I'd be surprised if you even visit.
Would you like to? Sorry. Yes. Would you like to draw out that question a little bit into the realms of SIPFA, and I don't know whether there's any subsidy involved in there and those sort of issues. Yeah.
So we've done a little bit of research, and the SIPFA quote is one individual visiting the council for 3 days, and we have to supply them with information from a checklist that SIPFA produce in advance. And they review that checklist and they confirm basically whether they agree with our self-assessment that we do on an annual basis in any case. But it's a external source verifying that and gives you further assurance if you choose to take it.
Councillor Bartlett.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I actually had a question on that, and it was, what are the consequences of not actually doing this? I wasn't aware that it hasn't been done by legacy councils. So, how important is it? Is it a statutory requirement, or just something it's nice to have?
It's not a statutory requirement, but we cannot say the internal audit department of BCP technically would meet all the criteria of the public sector internal audit standards because we haven't had the external assessment.
Do you want to come back, Councillor Bartlett?
On that basis, I think it's probably £3,000 is perfectly reasonable for what was being required, particularly if you're getting 3 days' work. So I do have another question, though, if that's all right. On the assurance framework, on the risk management responsible directorate service body. Just a query, you've got risk management against finance, and I understand the issues around risk management of finances, but I had a thought, looking at it, I thought that maybe project and programme management within the organisational development directorate would be more appropriate. And the reason I say that is, the need to probably project risk management more thoroughly throughout the organisation rather than focusing it within the finance department.
It's a perfectly reasonable challenge. In traditional local authority makeup, risk management tends to be clustered with insurance, so you have insurance and risk management managers, and therefore, because of the integral link, and obviously insurance is located in finance, and that's traditionally why risk management has been there also.
The reason is, it's one of the reasons why I think that larger organisations tend, in departments outside of the financial area, don't consider it quite as seriously as they do within finance. And if it's more generally spread in association with programme and project management, then you get a much more robust risk management organisation and structure. And so I think it goes hand in hand with project management rather than just within the confines of the financial directorate.
If I can give some assurance to Councillor Bartlett that the location is, yes, your point's valid, but the team go out to services. They're an enabler for services. They help services, support services in risk registers and risk management processes through their projects. So it's not a sort of an isolated specialism within finance. Their whole role is to get out into the organisation.
Councillor Brooke.
Thank you, Chair. It's to pick up actually on Stephen's first question to do with compliance, and it's really just following through a little bit further, if I may, and ask if without spending that 3,000 and getting the external view in terms of quality assurance, what's the potential reputational damage, bearing in mind we're a brand new council, if we have not done this and it has just been through internal audits only?
Certainly, there's a perception in internal audit circles that an external assessment has value and adds gravitas to the the effectiveness of the team. So I would certainly advocate spending £3,000.
I think I would make a comment on that to the extent that when I was canvassing for topics for members of Audit and Governance to explore in some of our additional meetings, more than one member raised the issue of who scrutinises us. So at the moment, it is left very much to Audit and Governance Committee to look at that internal audit performance, and that is without anything externally scrutinising our scrutiny of that function. So to some extent, it goes away on that particular part of our work to ensure that there is some external scrutiny of it. And so I, in talking to officers, have been encouraging of that direction of travel on the basis of what members have said right at the start. Now, whether that is sufficient, whether it should be wider than that, and so on, is another matter. But it does seem to me that since the legacy councils weren't doing it in recent times, it is an opportunity to make that extra step and to see whether that then becomes adequate for us, or whether we need to go further, or whether it represents good value for money as well. Hence the reason it's the third recommendation today. You're looking pensively at me, Councillor Cox.
I was going to reiterate what you were saying. I think on the basis that you're buying a badge, and it's SIPFA, which is quite a good badge, then it's probably money well spent. But I'm not entirely sure how much they're going to do for £3,000.
Well, hence my reason for saying I think it's a good marker to start with. We can then judge that as to whether we think it's good value, in terms of whether it's satisfying the function we want to be properly audited. Mr. Dossett, Grant Thornton.
Thank you, Chairman. I think I'll just add that, historically, the external auditor had a requirement under the Audit Commission regime to review internal audit in some detail. That no longer exists as a specific requirement, and there's also been a change in auditing standards, which means we can't formally rely on the work of internal audit. So I do think this seems an opportune time, especially since the teams have come together and there's a new team in place to have that external assessment. I think it seems a great opportunity to sort of set a line in the sand as this is a benchmark of where it should be. Because I suppose at the moment, obviously the team have done an assessment. We probably don't have quite a feel from an external point of view whether the resourcing and etc. is adequate. So I think it would be very helpful to have that external assessment at this stage.
Thank you, Mr. Dossett. Are there any other questions for Mr. Stannard? In that case, can I take us to the three recommendations? The first recommendation is to agree the BCP assurance framework. Could all members indicate if they support that?
Unanimous, yes, Chairman.
Thank you very much. The second recommendation is to provide any comments or feedback on the proposed draft 2021 internal audit plan. I think we've had some feedback on that, so I think we've fulfilled that requirement. And the third is to provide an opinion on the preferred options of the external assessment of internal audit. Those are the ones set out at paragraph 21. We've given this quite a lot of discussion. I will take a vote on it. All those in favour, please indicate.
Recommendation 3. Yes, that's unanimous as well.
So we will proceed with that, Mr. Stannard. And if you could bear in mind the comments that have been made by the members of the committee so that we can give it a proper assessment once it's taken place and we've seen the depth and breadth of the work that's been undertaken. And I think we probably welcome our external auditors, Grant Thornton, giving us comments at that stage as to whether it has represented a proper service and good value for money. Thank you very much. So that takes us on to item 9 on the agenda, which is the internal audit plan update, April to December 2019, and that again is you, Mr. Stannard.
It comes to every committee, so it's the quarter update of the internal audit work. Quarter 3, Legacy Council, was always the quarter where it made me feel a lot better because suddenly we hit the audit plan. A lot of audit work was being completed in the before, there was not a straight line relationship in the first half of the year in terms of the number of audits we should be through. So 27 audit assignments have been completed in the period. 3 partial audit opinions. We'll talk about those in a little bit more detail in a minute. And there are 30 audit assignments in progress. So at the moment, no material issues for audit and governance to consider in terms of are we not going to achieve the audit plan as we planned it. The caveat being we've always got that little 7% slippage from the old year into the new year, and at the end it doesn't quite align always to a 100% in the year type model. So in terms of those audit opinions with partial assurance, just talk you through them in a little bit more detail if I may. So the first one was the a pool market audit. So this is so there's weaknesses there around income collection and banking, and the recommendations that we've agreed with management and management have agreed to implement are on the one of the appendices. apologies for the format of those. I don't know if it's the same on yours, but the formatting of it's a bit horrible on the appendices. They're scattered over 2 pages. The second area was declarations of interest. Again, a little bit inherent as a result of BCP being formed, 3 legacy council approaches, different approaches, different ways of recording. All that's led to a bit of confusion. So therefore, I can only give partial assurance there that everything's as it should be. And then the final one, councillors' IT equipment. We found some weaknesses, particularly when councillors ceased being councillors, and the return of that IT kit in a way to safeguard the data on it. There were some weaknesses there that are also talked about in a bit more detail on one of the appendices. Happy to take any questions.
Ms. Coulter.
I just wanted to clarify for members of the public that the declarations of interest audit report relates to the declarations by officers, not by members. Just to sort of clarify that point.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Sorry, Chair.
Councillor Brooke.
More comment rather than questions, if that's all right, Chair. I was intrigued by the internal audit plan delivery and the figures as to which areas had exceeded the expected coverage in the time and those that hadn't. And I related it back to the 2021 figures and number of days being allocated to those. I was going to ask a question on that, but that has actually been answered in the previous item. So that was the first thing. So I had a clarification that's, if you like, being carried forward. But I have to say that I'm really delighted that the pool market audit report picked up on what I would consider to be very, very key issues. And the action plan looks as if it will address those very, very well. But it does worry me that methods of ways of payment and delays in paying money and lack of checking the public insurances of the market holders clearly was there, and it should never have been. So I'd just like to thank Nigel and his team for actually picking those up and creating a suitable action plan that can get around those issues.
I'd certainly endorse those comments, and I suppose those of us who've been councillors for a considerable period have probably come across similar instances elsewhere in the past. And it is reassuring to note there is a method for capturing these issues. So our thanks for that, Mr. Stannard. Councillor Bartlett. Could you use your microphone, Councillor Bartlett?
I thought it was on. Sorry. Yeah, paragraph 27, page 69. Head of Audit and Management Assurance manages other teams, and that's why those costs are not included in the overall team budget. I presume that's you, Nigel, is it? Yeah. Could you just tell us what other teams you manage in addition to this team?
Yeah, so clarity there is I am charged within those figures 100%, although I do manage the insurance team, risk management team,
emergency planning,
and emergency planning. Sorry, thank you. And emergency planning team and business continuity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting that other areas should be picking up some of your costs rather than have it apportioned to this figure?
No, it's to a large extent that's plain. There's an expectation that the chief internal auditor should be charged to internal audit.
Councillor Cox.
In view of the issues in the pool market, are there any similar areas of the council which deals in cash that might be subject to similar weaknesses?
Yes, there are, and part of our audit planning work, the part of high risks, is we skew our audit work to areas where cash collection is heavy. So, for example, car parks, seafront, pavilion. So those audits feature heavily, more frequently than in a non-cash environment. So it does take it into account in our audit planning.
But in view of the results from this one, is it not worth doing a little bit more? Is it changing your strategy slightly to, put more emphasis on that?
I should have said we do that. So we do an annual review of all the high risk cash areas. So car parks, Bournemouth Market, Bournemouth Seafront. So all those high volume cash areas are subject to annual audit.
And I assume I'm familiar with what happened in Bournemouth around cash accounting. I assume there were similar pieces of work taking place in Poole and in Christchurch by the predecessor councils.
That's correct.
If there are no more questions on this paper, we're asked to note the progress and any matters arising from the delivery of the internal audit plan. Are you satisfied that we note this report? That is agreed. Thank you very much. Takes us on to item 10 on the agenda, which is the governance of corporate health and safety and fire safety. We have with us, and if you'd like to step up to the places at the end of the table, Margarita Flikos and Philip Lawrence, if you would like to take your seats. And I think you're going to present your report jointly and then perhaps take some questions. If you're not familiar with this, if you could use the microphone whenever you're speaking and then it goes on the tape. So if you'd like to present.
Yes, I will talk through the main parts of the report. So this covers the new governance arrangements for health and safety and fire safety for BCP, and also some of the key actions, and then a bit about the team arrangements. So the governance arrangements centre on a health and safety and fire safety board, which is chaired by the chief executive, and it is a requirement that all the service directors will attend these quarterly board meetings, supported by the health and safety team and the fire safety team and the head of audit and governance. Feeding into those board meetings will be Service Directorate Health and Safety and Fire Safety meetings, which will be led by the Service Directors or a nominated person to get consultation. And below those, there will be options for Service Directorates to hold their operational health and safety or fire safety team meetings as well. All of that is shown in the government's framework. So we are expecting that new framework will be fit for the BCP Council. Another part of the governance framework is the Health and Safety Forum, which can also feed up into the board, which is sharing of best practice across the council and a more operational and practical group, and to also review new policies and procedures. So that, in a nutshell, is the overview of the governance arrangements. So the first Health and Safety and Fire Safety Board was held in November, where the health and safety and fire safety corporate policies were approved and the governance framework, and it was agreed at the Health and Safety and Fire Safety Board meeting that we would develop an action plan and have a corporate health and safety and fire safety risk register, both of which would be looked at each quarterly board meeting. So that's work in progress at the moment to get those items prepared. So briefly, the staffing and team structure, there was a management restructure of the Health and the Communities Directorate, which is where we sit within the council. And in December, I was appointed as manager across BCP for health and safety, and Philip Lawrence now is fire manager for across BCP Council. This will now enable much faster progress, I believe, towards working with the board and the governance arrangements. From the health and safety team, we have practitioners in Bournemouth, health and safety qualified professionals in Bournemouth and in Poole, and we're currently undergoing some recruitment as well. And for fire safety, we currently have staff based in Bournemouth. Operationally, we work with all the service units and schools across the area to give advice, support. Where incidents happen, we will be there to help investigate and try and support all the service directorates in what their services need to achieve. So that was really all I was going to say. No, so that's the summary to date. Thank you.
So if we hear on the fire safety side, and then I think we'll take questions collectively.
Well, thank you, Chair. For fire safety, Margaretta has really covered the update within her update. So currently, the fire safety team are primarily from Bournemouth Legacy Council. Myself, as a fire safety manager, one full-time and one part-time fire safety advisor. There is potentially some scope for a vacancy that was within Christchurch to utilise that in growing the team, and we're looking into how fire safety was conducted in Poole previously to see what we can draw from that, because arrangements weren't for a budgeted person, as it were. So we're exploring options on how to ensure we have suitable resource moving forward for fire safety.
Thank you. Members, questions? Councillor Bartlett.
Thank you, Chair. We're in this governance organisation. Who is responsible for monitoring the RIDDOR reports and inputting those?
That would fall within my team, and the RIDDOR reports form part of the health and safety report that I present to the Health and Safety Board. So within that report, it details all the RIDDORs that have occurred across the area.
Did you have any further questions, Councillor Bartlett? No. Councillor Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Grenfell tragedy has got an ongoing inquiry, and we don't know exactly when it will be reporting its recommendations, but obviously the London Local Authority Council was involved in that. Obviously, we're being told that we can expect an annual report. I would like to believe that because of the seriousness of that event, that if anything particularly from the Grenfell outcome is making recommendations to local authorities across the UK, that we might actually, as a committee, have an interim report based on something that we as a council should be implementing as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
I think you make a very good point there, Councillor Andrews. How would you respond to that?
Thank you, Chair. It is my understanding that that would be the case, given major changes following the Grenfell disaster, that this committee will receive an interim report on the amendments made and how they will affect this council moving forward.
Any other questions? I've got a couple of my own. And I suppose it's born out of experience, but it's experience only of Bournemouth. So we're now talking about a much bigger organisation. And I think we'd probably like the reassurance that the resource base, in your professional opinions, is sufficient to undertake and discharge your responsibilities, both in terms of health and safety and fire safety. I think that's my first question.
We are currently recruiting for a replacement health and safety advisor. That is key that we get that replacement advisor in place and have a second post being advertised as well to give support to the health and safety team. I think there will be a period of reflection needed as we go forward to see how it is working out, but certainly we need to get back to getting the additional advisor recruited and in post, and then I would suggest I need to monitor to determine the scope and resource needed as we go forward, really. I think at this moment in time we need to reflect on that as we develop the delivery plan and other plans as to, is the resource sufficient?
And on the fire side, Mr. Lawrence?
Thank you, Chair. With regards to fire safety, as currently there's no additional resource from either Legacy, Christchurch or Poole, we are exploring options on what the additional workload actually looks like. And instead of just taking it as two separate councils, seeing how many premises that would be required for risk assessments and supportive advice. With that, it's my understanding, I'm getting involved at this moment, exploration of options of how we can bring additional resource into the team of what is required to meet the required level of resource that we calculate.
That's quite encouraging, but it then leads me on to my second question, again if you could individually answer, and that is, given the huge changes, of course, that we're all experiencing by bringing the three predecessor councils and forming a new BCP council, are you content with your ability, with your resources, to undertake that work in these early stages, so that you've got the confidence that you are doing, if you like, all that you feel professionally you need to be doing, given that, if you like, we started on day one back on the 1st of April, and there would be a massive amount of work, therefore, to be undertaken?
I think the effective implementation of health and safety is us working well with the governance framework. So we need to embed the service directorate meetings, which is ongoing. We need to make sure that there is effective reporting of accidents and incidents. And we need to ensure that, that the board is fully engaged with the risks that are coming to it and the review of policies and procedures. So I think I would say we now have a framework in place which should facilitate our ability to deliver a effective service across the council, but that is subject to recruit, as I've already stated, recruiting, so we have sufficient staff and the effective other parts of the governance framework coming together.
And for you, Mr. Lawrence?
Thank you, Chair. I second Margaret's comments. Personally, we have the the policies in place for both health and safety and fire safety, and the governance framework which supports those. It's our role now to embed that within the culture of the organisation, because that is what will see us through to the end goal of best practice in the organisation.
I wondered, Chief Executive, whether I could ask you, as, if you like, the professional head of the organisation and chairing as well, for your comments and whether you're satisfied in both of those fields.
Thanks, Chairman. Yes, I think overall I'm satisfied. What we need to do is make sure the arrangements work and that we get the right standards of health and safety and fire safety throughout. So at the moment I've got no reason to believe that we won't. However, we need to see how it goes during the next year. We have not had any concerns raised about either lack of resource or lack of ability to deliver. However, I want to keep a watching eye on this. We've had the first meeting or so of the board. We have the next one next week, I think it is, isn't it? So we're constantly reviewing the position. As a former fully qualified environmental health officer that started out in health and safety, I'm fully aware of the importance of both health and safety and fire safety for the organisation, and there's no way I'm going to let that slip. So you have my assurance. Obviously, if we find that we need to put more resource in, then we'll address that.
Thank you. That's the answer I was hoping that we would hear, because it is an absolutely vital pair of functions, and it is only too easy to put it on one side with all the other pressures that exist and think, well, we'll do more about that later. Later is often too late. So I'm reassured to hear that.
Good to add, that's why I've agreed that I should personally chair the board. I think it is critical for the organisation.
Yeah, and I'm sure that all members of Audit and Governance would fully endorse that you do that. Ms Coulter, did you indicate?
It was purely procedural, really, that, of course, if you are members of the committee want to have an interim report on the assurance you can get from that governance framework, once the board is met and once that work has been done, then, of course, you have every right to request that back, but you may be assured by the comments of the Chief Executive that at this moment you don't need that, and leave that to officers to flag with you if we need to bring something back. But of course you can ask for that report to come back.
Well, I'm in the hands of committee, and I was considering the questions that were being asked about recommendation 1 as to whether actually in these early stages of BCP Council that suggestion is one that we would welcome. Would that gain support from members of the committee? Not considering that it's going to be repeatedly necessary, but I think for our own reassurance that would probably supply the information we needed. Would that be something we would want to support? Yes? So, ask Mr Hampton, I think, would that be something we should weave into recommendation 1, do you think? Given that it, at the moment, is about reporting to this committee on an annual basis. So if we could amend recommendation 1 to incorporate the suggestion made by Ms Coulter.
And to put a timescale on it, so...
Well, it needs to be timely, and it needs to be useful, not just to us, but to the organisation, and indeed for the reassurance of the public. So I wonder, Chief Executive, what timescale would you recommend we put on that?
I think 6 months would allow us 2 more cycles of the corporate board, which I would have said would probably be the appropriate. I think any shorter than that might be too soon. Longer than that doesn't feel like it's close enough to keep an eye on it.
Would that have the support of members? So if we were to amend recommendation 1 along those lines, I'm sure that would gain our support, but we'll take a vote on it anyway. All those in favour, please indicate.
That's unanimous, Chairman.
Thank you very much. And then the second recommendation is for noting, and perhaps if we could add to noting to thank Margarita Fricos and Philip Lawrence for the work that they've undertaken with our new organisation, and we look forward to hearing back from you at future meetings. And if we could note in that way, would we all be agreed? Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you both for coming this evening. Takes us on to item 11 on the agenda, which is BCP Council Declarations of Interest, Gifts and Hospitality Policy for Officers. And I think, Mr. Stannard, you're going to introduce this item.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so the Audit and Governance Committee obviously has a key role to prevent fraud, error, wrongdoing, bribery, etc. in the Council. And one of the ways it does that is to review governance arrangements and the policies that exist. What we've got here is a draft BCP Declaration of Interest, Gifts and Hospitality Policy, which is a cornerstone of preventing those things. So at the moment you will see it's a work in progress. So this is an early consultation and it will come back to this committee to approve the final version. Management team will also look at it. A couple of key features, if I may. One of the key features is for senior officers, and there's an issue around how senior. At the moment, we're suggesting tier 3 and above in here, so that's service directors, corporate directors, and the chief executive would be required to produce a positive nil return if indeed there's nothing to declare. The legacy councils didn't require that. In other words, they only required a declaration to be made if there was one to be made. But the feeling now is that the senior leaders of the council, from the officer side, should have a clear and transparent declaration so that's the reasoning for that one. Further down in the policy, there is also some guidance that was lacking in the legacy council policies around relating to sponsorship. And when the council sponsors an event, it needs to consider, or officers need to consider, who's involved in that sponsorship. So it basically says the policy applies when we're talking about sponsorship. Happy to have any questions, Chair.
Well, members, we're not only asked to note this report, we're asked to offer any feedback. So polite feedback, I'm sure, would be encouraged. Councillor Cox.
I don't know, I'm afraid I've not had too much time, I've only skim read this, but so I'd like to look at it in more detail. But I do feel that the members' policy is particularly weak, and therefore I do want to have a look at that in due course. I've already put that forward. So how much is this based on what the members' policy is?
It's not at all based on what the members' policy. So this is a brand new BCP best practice. It looks at what the legacy councils had in place, but it also looks at best practice across the sector. What do some of the very big local authorities, Leeds, Birmingham, etc., have in place? Because we are one of those big councils now.
Well, I'd welcome that. There's one particular issue which I just spotted, which is on 611, where it talks about exceptional circumstances. If a gift was to be accepted, it might refusing the gift might cause offence. There's no limit to what that is. I would have thought you'd still need to put a limit in it.
The background to that one is from experience that a little bit of wriggle room. Twinning is a good example. So when you have you're twinned with traditionally those organisations come with gifts, where sometimes it's difficult to judge what the value of that gift is, and to refuse it would cause offence. So that's what's meant by that clause there. So it is very definitely an exceptional item, but it is quite hard to put a monetary threshold to, because sometimes you don't know what in Councillor Slade's example there, a Chinese diplomat, vase is worth.
That would cause huge effect.
Sorry, surely that vase would be the council's property, not necessarily the individual's. Yeah. So I'm not quite sure whether that's applicable necessarily.
I think the point that Mr. Stannard is making is it may be presented to a senior officer at Tier 3 or above, but it still needs that declaration even though it then becomes the council's property. And so it is twinning, but it's also organisations from other countries who we may be looking to have commercial relations with, and people in some circumstances can be very easily offended. But I think your point is well made. We need to make sure that is fail-safe as far as those senior officers are concerned.
Can I make an extra point, Chair? Bearing in mind what Councillor Cox said around he'd like to could I suggest that if members did have any views, having read it, that they would email me, and then I could work with Mr. Hampton and put those comments in the minutes to the meeting?
Yes, certainly. I think actually, as I'm considering what Councillor Cox was raising, that particular item around twinning and around commercialisation perhaps needs a little bit more narrative to draw it out properly and fully so that it is totally transparent to everybody, and most particularly transparent and well understood by those who are making the declarations, so there is no room for doubt. And I think it probably needs just that little bit of extra time and effort put into it. Councillor Bartlett.
It was just, I noted an open-ended sentence on paragraph 8.1 on 103. Nigel, it's not, I accept, but you've said it's a draft now, so I didn't realise that at the time. Additional roles and responsibilities of corporate directors, it's in that paragraph there. You look at the last bullet point, it says securely stored and maintained by, and then it stops.
Noted, Chair.
Are you able to indicate what the missing wording is, or do you want to come back to us?
It's on page 103.
Okay, yeah, what we were in and ahhing.
So is your proposal to come back to members of Audit and Governance once that debate's been concluded?
Correct.
Members happy with that?
We should build that into the recommendations.
So would that be something we could do you think? Certainly. Councillor Slade.
Sorry, this is a very minor point, but I think it's relevant. Is in the definition of terms, you talk about partner, meaning a civil partner or other member of a couple consisting of two people who are not married but are living together. So you talk about partners, friends, and relatives. You don't actually talk about spouse, which means if you're married, you're all right, but if you're not married, you've got a problem. So I just think we've missed spouse from there, and that should be there. Oh, I'll tell that to my husband.
No, thank you for that. I think it's a really important point. I've seen that mistake happen elsewhere outside the council, and it's one that does need to be corrected. Are there any other?
Quick point. Obviously, this is a draft and it doesn't come live until the 1st of April 2020. But obviously, if this has got some changes and good ideas compared with the current system, will officers be able to access this prior to the 1st of April so they can get into good habits now?
Mr. Stannard.
The short answer to that is no. The legacy arrangements will carry on. So part of the rollout of this policy, there'll be some training, awareness sessions, and then a period at which to be determined. For example, do we say by the end of May we expect all these declarations to be in place, and the monitoring officer or the chief executive or myself to have those in our sticky fingers, and so we can assure the Audit and Governance Committee at a point in time that it's all in place and complies with the policy.
Could I perhaps, as the head of paid service, ask the chief executive's comment about, because it isn't that many officers, tier 3 and above, what do you think in practical terms would satisfy what Mr. Stannard's just said?
Sure, I have an opinion, to be honest, Chairman. I'm trying to work through what the best way of doing it would be.
Whatever it is, we want to make sure it works in practice, and that there isn't any grey in between here and when it starts.
At the moment, obviously legacy policies apply, and therefore the audit work we've done gives limited assurance that partial assurance that those arrangements are right across the board. So I cannot give that assurance at the moment. That's the whole point of the policy.
Ms. Coulter.
I think in relation to this policy and bringing it in across BCP, we will be rolling out, as Nigel says, training and awareness, both at sort of director strategy group and then down through teams. And we'll be able to certainly, I'll be able to go out and talk to management teams and go through this. This is what we did before when we rolled something out from one of the predecessor councils. We went out to the management teams and we spoke to them and we tried to embed it that way as well, so that through those management teams, you're then enabling all of the staff to be aware of it. So from the 1st of April, we can get those declarations in. In relation to senior officers, you do have the assurance through the related party transactions and the preparation of the accounts that any interest that a senior officer has, if they're involved in decision making in relation to a contract or a decision, has to be declared as part of that process when we're reviewing the transactions and payments made to third party through the accounts. So there is a way of reviewing, having the assurance around those potential conflicts of interest that will be inherent anyway through that process. But this needs to be embedded. There is a gifts and hospitality policy in each of the preceding councils that we are already, processing. Some of that awareness that isn't there at the moment will come through promoting this proposed change. So it should prompt any current declarations that need to be made as well.
Yeah, just timing.
But I think from purposes of staff and knowing when this is actually going to apply, we need that date. And I think the 1st of April is the appropriate date to have. From this date, this will apply. Until then, the preceding council's policies will apply. That's the current position policy-wise at the moment.
Well, the Vice Chairman just pointed out to me we are almost on the cusp of that, but in any event. But I think the point's been made and reflected from Audit and Governance. We were asked to offer feedback, and that's what we've been doing, whether you like the feedback or not. And it wasn't a trick question to Chief Executive. I was just trying to make sure that whatever comes out of here is something that is doable, rather than making a straitjacket that simply won't work. Councillor Slade.
Thank you, Councillor Beasley. I'm just a little bit concerned about the hospitality restrictions, because I'm very aware that in 6.13 it says hospitality is food, drink, accommodation or entertainment, and then in 6.15 it says the following hospitality should never be accepted, and that actually talks about sporting and cultural events, when actually senior officers who are working within the arts world, or for example, the BSO, tickets for BSO are regularly at a high figure, and it would be normal and reasonable in some circumstances for senior officers to attend things like that. So I'm wondering whether 615 could be rather restrictive, where we're actually trying to foster a lot more cultural work. Just a comment.
So I suppose the question is this is paragraph 615 new, or is it being collected from one or more of the predecessor councils? And I don't know.
The other factor in there is talking about any hospitality in the employee's own time. Well, evening things is the employee's own time, and that feels far too restrictive, and people could get themselves in a lot of bother doing something that's completely legitimate, and I wouldn't want them to do that.
So I'd perhaps suggest that it is a draft, and perhaps we need to clarify the intent behind paragraph 615 and the difference with 613, and I would suggest that that's where offers such as the ones, as Councillor said, is just set out, are made direct to an employee without going through the council first. So if tickets to, for instance, the BSO are offered to the council and allocated to an officer to attend in their own time, or if they are offered to an officer who then declares them to the council, I think that's the clarification that we perhaps need to build into the policy. I think the intention behind 615 is direct offers of hospitality to an individual without the knowledge or awareness of the council as an organisation.
So would it be acceptable to members of Audit and Governance if we ask the officers to take that away and report back to this committee at probably at the next regular meeting, not one of our special ones, but the next regular meeting, so that we can consider that and then make a decision on it? Would that work for all parties, basically?
Yes.
So I think you need to go away and think about the issues that have been raised, particularly in the light of what Mr. Osgood just said.
I think the issue with that, Chair, is that the policy may well be in force. When's the next meeting? Is it February? Actually, there's one in February, isn't there?
That's an extra meeting.
An extra. Let us work out whether or not we can accommodate that intent before the policy needs to become operational.
We can bring it to an extra meeting.
Just a quick question is whether we should be differentiating between the extra meetings and normal meetings, and just say if we've got a bit of business, should we just bring it to the next appropriate meeting, the audit committee? We could hit that before the 1st of April.
You're perfectly happy with that. The special ones tend to be presentations, but I don't think there's any reason why we couldn't just take an item of business that needs to be dealt with in a timely way. So could we leave that with you, Mr. Stannard? And if you're ready by that date, then please bring it back at that date.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So just turning to the recommendation, are the committee happy that we can note the report? And we've obviously offered feedback, and I think that's quite worthwhile, but you're happy to note. Agreed?
Sorry, Chairman, and we've requested that this comes back to the committee at the earliest reasonable opportunity.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much. Takes us on to item 12 on the agenda, which is the BCP Constitution. And I think that Tony Coulter is going to introduce this item as the monitoring officer, but I suspect that Chief Executive, Mr. Osgood-Thorpe, Mr. Richards may have other comments to feed in at the stage when we've heard that presentation. So, Ms. Coulter, if you could present the report.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm sure that the Chairman of the working group and other members of the working group will also want to add to what I say. So I just wanted to provide an overview of the discussions and the conclusions that have been reached following 3 meetings, useful meetings with the working group. And if I run through very briefly each of the areas of work contained within the report, and then if others wish to comment on that, and I'm available to answer any of the constitutional and legal questions flowing from it. So first of all, the item on the statutory officers' disciplinary arrangements. And as the report states, the Council has to have in place arrangements for dealing with the statutory process where there is a potential dismissal or disciplinary action to be taken against the head of paid service, the chief finance officer or the monitoring officer. This was recognised by the Shadow Authority and was acknowledged, and the current constitution provides that a holding position pending this review. The regulations and the national guidance now agreed with the negotiating committee provide that framework, and in essence there needs to be an investigation and disciplinary committee. Is what it's called in the national guidance, so we've replicated that, and an independent persons panel, and a process for appeal. And what that does is that committee would consider serious allegations that could amount to disciplinary or dismissal of one of the statutory officers, and serve as the commissioning committee for an independent report that would come back to it and then form the basis of a recommendation to Council or other action. And the independent persons panel is another check in the system, and that's a panel that consists of 2 or more of the independent persons that are appointed by the Council under the Localism Act. So those independent persons that come to Standards Committee and deal with standards complaints in relation to members, the law provides that they also have a role in this process and provide some independent check on the internal arrangement. The terms of reference are set out as an appendix, and I've also, within the body of the report, there's a link to the rather lengthy Chief Executive's Handbook, but within that there is a flow chart that goes through that process. But if there are particular questions about how that would work in practice, I'd be happy to answer them. And the proposal and the recommendation from the working group is that committee consists of 7 members, and that includes the leader of the council and 1 other member of the executive, and 5 non-executive members. And that is a practice that is followed in other councils. The next item the working group considered was the issue as to whether all councillors should be required, wherever possible, to sit on at least one committee. And that was the case in one of the preceding councils' constitutions, and the view of the working group is that councillors should sit on at least one committee. The next item on the next page is in regard to the item that comes forward on the council agenda every month, where as full council you receive copies of minutes of all committees. It's an historic arrangement, probably predating the electronic systems that we now have, and it was agreed by the working group that that's superfluous and not required. So you will be receiving recommendations where you have to make decisions as opposed to just receiving endless committee minutes. Voting on appointments. This relates to the question of voting for chairman and vice chairman of committees, for example, and whether that should be by way of secret ballot or not. The view of the working group was that this was not something they thought Audit and Governance Committee should be deciding, that this should be determined by full council. And the proposal, the current proposal from the working group is that the Audit and Governance Committee should recommend to full council that it receives a report in March or at one of its later meetings setting out the options, and that there is in effect a vote at full council on this matter, so that all members then can express a view one way or another. The next issue is quite a significant one. It relates to the right of councillors and ward councillors to call in applications to planning committee, and also whether residents as well, if they make objections, should, if a certain threshold is reached, ensure that matters go to planning committee rather than be delegated to officers. Mr. Perrins, the Head of Planning, is also in attendance tonight if members have any questions about the practicalities and the thresholds that come into play there. But the working group's recommendations are at paragraph 19. And having consulted with members and with the Head of Planning, are that the call-in period should commence when electronic publication of the application is put onto the website, rather than when the application is logged and verified, because there may be a slight delay. So make sure that 30-day period is a 30-day period. That where there are amendments to the plans which require a further public consultation period, that there should be a further right of call-in during that period, so that if board members find that things have changed and actually now they do wish to call in the application, they're given that opportunity to do that. That when a certain number of signatories are obtained to object to the proposal, of those living, working or studying in the area from different addresses, that the application be considered by the committee. At the moment it's considered the number should be 20, but that is for the committee to consider as to whether that is the correct threshold, and the Head of Planning has some information available as to the impact of the different thresholds, whether it's 10 or 20, on the numbers potentially coming to each planning committee. The question of retrospective applications was considered and suggested that this be considered at a further date. So the question was whether if an application comes in for a retrospective planning permission, that automatically goes to committee. I think the working group decided that, on balance, that probably wasn't appropriate to recommend at this point, but that some further work should be done with the Head of Planning to monitor and consider what the nature of those retrospective applications are and whether there is an argument for that being changed in the future. And finally, it was agreed that the Head of Planning should have slightly wider discretion. At the moment, the Head of Planning has discretion to bring things forward to committee, so delegate up in effect, that is always there. Now, legally, that would always be there anyway, but the way that the Constitution is drafted it restricts it somewhat. So the proposal is just to broaden that out, so that the Head of Planning has a broad delegation to authority to raise things up to committee where appropriate. The next item relates to meeting dates and times. That's already been dealt with by full council at the last meeting, and the working group are very keen to ensure that there is that sort of continual review of meeting dates, places and times as we go forward over the next year. And then finally, in terms of substantive issues, I suppose, the public participation and access. There is a proposed petition scheme which was lacking in the previous constitution within the proposed amendment, that looks at the nature of petitions, where they should go and how they should be dealt with, so that there would be a threshold. So a certain number of signatures would be dealt with by an officer and responded to. Some would come to the portfolio holder and some would be heard by full council, much as the parliamentary petition schemes operate. There are also changes proposed to the public questions and statements at committees, and the view of the working group was that the total number of questions and statements per year would be 4, as it currently is, and that the statements at full council and the questions at full council should relate to anything within the council's area or scope, as it does at the moment, but that potentially, where you're looking at cabinet and other committees, they could be limited to items on the agenda. There was debate on that. There was no clear majority either way, and I think the view of the working group was that needed further fleshing out and discussion at this meeting, and I know the European Scrutiny Board also considered it and made a recommendation that certainly from its perspective, it would like to be able to hear from the public, and that questions and statements should not be limited to items on the agenda. So that's the view from the European Scrutiny Board. On the recording of votes, there was some discussion and debate about whether the public should know in every case or in certain cases how members of committees have voted on items. So at full council currently, if 25% of those members present want to have a full recorded vote, they can ask for that. and a full recorded vote is then taken. One option for members is that could be replicated for committees. So you could have in place a system where if 25% of those members present at that committee ask for a recorded vote is taken. Another option is that every single vote is a recorded vote, and the way in which every councillor has voted is recorded. That's possible, and we have come up with a form that would make it possible, but it would be probably somewhat bureaucratic and would mean that it would take more time at each meeting to do that. So that's for debate, really, I think, tonight and for you to consider. And finally, some other updates. The Audit and Governance Committee, I think on the 14th of November, you received a comparison and appraisal of your own terms of reference and agreed that they should be revised slightly, and those revised terms of reference are included in this report for completeness. The shadow authority references within the Constitution should go, it's suggested. They're now no longer required. And there will be further issues that are identified and come forward. And I think for you tonight is also to consider how regularly the working group meets and reports back to you on any issues and changes that are raised by officers, members and members of the public, so that you can retain that oversight of the Constitution and how it's working. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms Coulter. I wonder, Chief Executive and other senior officers, whether you'd like to add to what Ms Coulter's already said.
Happy to, if I may. Thank you, Chairman. There's one or two areas where I think it's really careful wording is required, so you don't build in either punitive arrangements that we can't meet. So just the example about all councillors will sit on at least one committee. If, for example, we had an independent member who, through the allocation of seats, ends up with one seat on a committee which meets in the mornings and they can't meet in the mornings, I wonder if you just need to think about the wording, whether it should be that the intention is that all councillors will sit on one committee. But what I wouldn't want to see is a rule built into a constitution which is effectively unenforceable. And I think there's one or two places where we just need to be really clear about the wording, that we don't create unintended consequences. That's one. The other is in paragraph 23, where we talk about the location of meetings, and it says, well, sometimes on an exceptional basis, need to be different. It's how you define whether somewhere needs to be in a different place. It might be better for it to be in a different place, but do you build in a case where you have to demonstrate need in order to hold a meeting that only relates to a matter in Christchurch? You want to move it from Paul to Christchurch. You might say, is that need or is that obviously better? So I think we just have to be really careful about the wording in these, that you don't build in rules that create a barrier which you don't, I don't know, if you decided to hold this meeting in Christchurch because it's a Christchurch meeting, and then you get challenged by a member of the committee because it doesn't need to be here, because people could travel from here to Paul to hear it. So that's my only issue, is being really precise about the wording that we build in. I think there's good changes. I think generally the changes will be beneficial. I'm just worried about those couple of bits of wording that we just need to be clear we don't build in, and say, unintended consequences.
No, Chair, I have no additional comments to make.
It's very helpful, sage advice, Chief Executive, if I may say so. At the appropriate moment, perhaps we'll ask Mr. Perrins to step up if you'd like to, and we can, when we deal with planning issues, perhaps you could just present your thoughts and your data, which Ms. Coulter referred to. I'm in your hands, members, as to how we go about this. Do we go about these one by one, or does anybody have some general comments? A couple of people have indicated they wish to speak already. I think probably the most logical way is to run through these item by item as we get to each substantive item, and perhaps the comments would best be addressed, I think, to the monitoring officer in order that we get the the correct sort of legal definition on some of these issues, because I think it could be a little bit messy otherwise and inconclusive if we're not careful. And we need to bear in mind the comments that have been made by the Chief Executive, because we have to get this right, and we've got to get it right first time. It's absolutely critical. So the first, which was divided into three, was on the statutory officers' disciplinary arrangements and dealing with the items as they came. The first was adopting the terms of reference for new investigation and disciplinary committee. That's paragraph 8. Was that the item you wanted to
comment on paragraph 7?
On paragraph 7. Okay. And I know that Councillor Slade wanted to raise something on, I think it was the one committee issue.
Yeah, I'm fine on that one. So,
yeah. So do you want to deal with that
one?
Yes,
thank you, Chairman. It's on this officer's disciplinary arrangements. It's just that reading through paragraph 7, I'm wondering who will decide whether someone has appropriate experience in terms of length and nature of service. Thank you.
Ultimately, it would be a matter for full council to make a decision as to who is appointed to that committee. I think the working group were of the view that although it can't be set in stone and it can't be a requirement, a job description as it were, for membership of that committee, because it is a decision for full council, I think it was a framing for the groups and for the other members that will be putting themselves forward to say, can you think about those members that may have experience? So it's more of a guidance rather than a rule.
No, that's fine. I'm happy if it's a council decision.
And then, sorry, Councillor Andrews is on this one.
Just another couple of points to flesh out that terms of reference, which is half a side of A4, so it needs a bit more fleshing out. An inquiry: would it be a committee that would be established at the beginning of each council year, or would it be a committee that would be suddenly brought together, a bit like a sheriff's posse, as and when needed? Is it going to be politically balanced? Is it going to have substitute members? Because obviously it could be a situation that if you don't allow substitute members, it could be one of the councillors or two of the councillors on the committee are the ones who are involved in the complaint. So it needs a bit more fleshing out, I believe.
Yeah, the committee would be politically balanced. It would be a committee of the council, and it would be formally, nominations and appointments would be made annually, as for every other committee. So therefore, there will be a chair elected as well, and then there will be arrangements in place should the need ever arise to call a meeting of that committee. So the purpose is to have it in place and with a chairman established on an annual basis. It will be politically balanced, and members would be appointed annually. Substitutes would also be able to be appointed in line with the General Council procedure rules. So it would be subject to all of the normal procedure rules that would apply to other committees. So were there conflicts of interest, and of course they would be dealt with.
Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you, Chair. Paragraph 9, the actual recommendation to add to the paragraph in terms of reference. I'm not quite sure. Is it being expressed in legal jargon or legal phrasing? I'm not sure that we need the word against in that. Disciplinary action against in respect of. It doesn't read quite right.
Thank you, Councillor. It should read in respect of. And the need to amend the terms of reference is that the Appeals Committee at the moment only deals with appeals against decisions to dismiss in respect of officers. We do need, insofar as statutory officers are concerned, there's an additional right to have an appeal against any disciplinary action, not just dismissal. So that's why this has been proposed that this is added into the Appeals Committee.
Chair, it was just for clarification of the wording.
Thank you. Well spotted. So I think that then deals with the first section, which is statutory officers' disciplinary arrangements. We all done on that? Okay, so the second is about all councillors to sit on one committee, bearing in mind the points made by the Chief Executive. Was this the issue you wanted to comment on, Councillor Slade? Yes, certainly.
I've got a concern over political balance, because obviously we know that there have been situations recently where people have said, well, actually, you're not actually technically entitled to sit on a committee, and you're entitled to sort of what's left over. And I am concerned that if we require that somebody has to sit on a committee, that actually we risk actually then forcing an upset to the political balance, which is under the Local Government Act. So I don't know that it's... and also I wonder, how is it enforceable? Because the only person that can remove somebody from being a councillor is his electorate. So unless you're going to take them to standards, and even then, what can you do? So I think the rules of being a councillor is you have to attend a council meeting every 6 months, and that is the rule. I genuinely don't think it's enforceable. I think it's preferable, and I think it's unfortunate if people aren't on a committee, but they may have very good reasons for doing so. For example, ill health I wouldn't want somebody to feel that they had to give up their position if they were extremely unwell. So I have great doubts about that.
Councillor White.
Sorry, just on that point. I mean, I agree with Councillor Slade. I think she makes a good point. But perhaps it should read something like all councillors should be given the opportunity to sit on at least one committee. If they choose not to, they choose not to. Just a thought.
Councillor Cox.
Yeah, I agree. It wasn't meant to be trying to put people into slavery. It was just really meant to give everybody an opportunity to contribute to the council. And if they can't for whatever reason, then so be it. But this was really meant to give people an opportunity and not try to be excluded because they may not be the right person. Their face may not fit. So I think that this is the idea, is trying to give everybody an opportunity.
Yes, certainly. Could you respond?
Yeah, I think it could be drafted to explain that and slightly more generally, wherever it is, possible or practicable or lawful. The political balance arrangement should mean that in every case, every member can sit on one of the committees. Although it will be for full council to decide those that aren't within political groups, there will always be a portion of seats that will be unfilled by the political balance distributed amongst the groups, and therefore full council to then appoint those non-aligned members to those committees by name. And I think what the working group were keen to ensure was that, maybe one of those others didn't get sort of 4 seats, and then 2 of the other members didn't have any. So, and I think it's about but at the end of the day, council can, in any event, amend the constitution and decide not to amend the constitution at that point and decide to appoint who it wishes. So, again, as you say, Councillor Slade, it's not enforceable as such in that way, as the law would be. But I think the working group were keen to have a reference point within there to encourage council to ensure that it is looking right across the membership, but also to make it absolutely clear to members, either before they're elected or once they are elected, that there is an expectation that they will sit on at least one committee. And I think that was the view of the working group, that really councillors should expect, if they're asked, to sit on a committee.
Yes, I think that word expectation was one that was used actually at the working group, and I think it sums up the position very well. Yes. Interesting to note that we decided not to put a maximum on members. Not that I'm looking at any particular member when I say that. Councillor Dunlop.
Thank you, Chairman. Is there a Is there a potential to have it reflected in the scheme of allowances in any way? Because there is an opportunity for someone to do nothing. I'm trying to think of a nice way to put it, but the potential is clearly there. That can it be reflected in the scheme of allowances? That if you're not contributing to the work of the council and committees, then perhaps you don't receive the full. I'm just putting it out there because there are people that sit on several committees and they're really involved and they're really interested, and then let's not pretend we have some that don't.
You might be ill.
Is that a possibility?
Ms. Coulter?
Thank you. We did have discussions as a shadow authority about that before the previous review of the members' allowances as to how in a sense you can performance-related pay for councillors, in a sense, or recognising it's very, very difficult. And speaking to the IRP, it is very difficult because you might have someone who is a councillor who's a very active ward councillor and doing an awful lot in representing their residents and acting for them, but may not be sitting on a formal committee or more than one formal committee. So how do you judge that the ward member role and then the committee decision-making role? But it is something that if we have a full-scale review of members' allowances, which I think is proposed halfway through, so it'll be next year, then that is something that we could start earlier and take that into account.
So, members, are we content to leave that final wording, to reflect the flexibility that I think we've all been talking about? Yes? Okay. So the next one was minutes in the council agenda. I think I saw agreement around the room on that one. Voting on appointments and, if you like, passing that forward to full council to make the decision. Certainly the working group, I think, were unanimous on that. Were they not, Councillor Cox?
Were unanimous in their differences. I think everybody
unanimous about allowing full council to make that decision. So are members of this committee content that we do that? There's nothing like a bit of upward delegation, is there? And then we come to the calling in of planning applications to committees. I think it would be very helpful, Mr. Perrins, if you could perhaps just give your initial thoughts, having reflected on what the options are for us, and then perhaps members will have some questions which can be directed either to you or back to Ms. Coulter. Mr. Perrins.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so good discussion of the working group. So just to sort of quickly go through the points in a bit more detail, which are in the report. So I think the first one around the call-in period in terms of when it should start. I fully support the proposal to change the date it starts, because at the moment it's from the valid date, which for various reasons can often not be publicised for many days. So there's time lost in the process. So I think that needs to be redressed, and I would support it being taken from the point of the electronic publication, which is pretty much when everybody starts to know about planning applications. So the 30 days would start from that point. So that is my view on that one. The next one, about the amendments. Again, I think that's a sensible suggestion, because there may well be material change in an amendment, which if it goes out for further public consultation, should, in my view, allow for further call-in, because it's material to trigger a further public consultation, so therefore why wouldn't it be subject to the same arrangements? So I would endorse that one as well. I think tying it into the second consultation period in terms of when that second call-in should take place is sensible in terms of managing the planning application process and not losing time thereafter. So that one I think is very straightforward, subject to reviews. And then we're on to the one around the resident signatories and whether there should be a threshold
and a bit of discussion around that. And I've done a bit of work on statistics just to aid the discussion. The report talks about 20 letters of objection from different addresses. So just in terms of some context around that, there's been 9 planning committees since April, and the average number of items across those 9 committees is about 5 items per committee. Although some of them have been very busy. For example, November had 12 items and was obviously a very long committee. October had 8. So it does fluctuate a bit. But by and large, the normal amount of, a good amount of planning applications for any planning committee is probably between 6 and 8. So that's just something to contextualise around how much work a planning committee can get through in one sitting. So if the threshold were 20 letters of objection, that would have meant in the period where the planning committees have taken place, there would have been 46 planning applications which would have triggered that threshold. Of course, some of those already went to planning committee anyway, so sort of discounting those ones out, and those which were refused and therefore never would have made it to planning committee, it would result in around an extra 2 or 3 planning applications per planning committee. If you then take that back to 10, because we had a discussion at the working group around whether it should be 10, it essentially is double. So in total, there were 85 planning applications which would trigger a threshold of 10, but when you take out those which went to committee anyway and refusals and things like that, it comes down to about 5 or 6 extra planning applications. And in my view, that's starting to, in terms of the business of the planning committee, is starting to load a lot of business onto that. It's not to say we shouldn't do it, it just means that the amount of meetings would then be affected. And there's already a meeting every 3 weeks. So the cycle around planning committee would be very onerous in terms of resourcing it, and therefore that is a consideration for this committee to consider. I've also looked at 15 as a sort of middle ground, and that would have had a starting point of 67 planning applications, which when you take out those which already went and wouldn't have gone anyway, you get down to around 3 and 4. So I think 15 and 20 is manageable in terms of current setup. 10 feels like it would start to place pressure on the system. We need to think very carefully how we'd resource it. But I also feel that with the amended call-in arrangements, there'd also be greater scope for members to call things in, and therefore that right would also help to manage the process and pick up those which had strong residence objections anyway. So hopefully those statistics are helpful in terms of your considerations. So sort of the main points are that 15 and 20 is manageable, 10 would need to look at the resources to support committee. Just in terms of the other points in the reports, retrospective applications, the recommendation is to consider that going forward, and this committee may want to look at in the future. The Working Party, we had a good debate and sort of different views, and as suggested there, it needs to go forward to a further consideration. And then the final point was just around the flexibility to make sure that if all these safeguards in the process fail for whatever reason, there's always another option of being able to refer to planning committee at the head of planning's discretion, and the current wording is quite restrictive, so it felt like good practice to make it as flexible as possible in the wording to cover all bases. So they're my comments on those suggestions. I support those Working Party recommendations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perrins. That's extremely useful, I think. Councillor White.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I really do welcome some clarity about the number of objections which would trigger a trip to the planning committee. 20 to me sounds sort of reasonable as a starting point, maybe even 25, but you can always review it in 12 months' time. But I certainly like the direction of travel on that one. Thank you.
Councillor Shade.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of concerns. I'm generally supportive of the recommendations, but I'm a little bit worried about amendments that don't constitute a new consultation period. You will probably recall a case in Broadstone a few years ago where something which the residents and councillors would have deemed a material objection wasn't deemed a material objection, and therefore it didn't constitute an amendment, and therefore it went through, and it was shocking. Now, what worries me is I think there's been a case in another part of Poole where something didn't trigger a material amendment, and I'm a bit worried about. In these cases, this is great, but what about there can be quite significant amendments that aren't material, and that worries me a little bit. The second issue I've got is that I think it's great that you've now got this head of planning catch-all around, if you miss the deadline, the head of planning has got the constitutional right to take things in. But I'm worried actually about this dragging you in to far too many cases, and in the long term doesn't become tenable for you to do your job if you're constantly being dragged into, I missed the deadline, can you have another look at it? So that does worry me a little bit. I think it's right that we go with a higher level. I think 2025 is right, but I just wonder whether, as we improve our technology, whether it's possible for members to have it flagged when objections or comments are made on applications in their ward. Because we all look at the cases when they first come in, but unless we go back to every case in our ward every couple of days, we don't know if something's become contentious. It's not always the ones we think that are going to become contentious. And it's our job then to manage those residents and help to assess if it goes to planning. But often we aren't able to get involved because we don't know unless we keep checking back in, and I don't think that's credible, but there might be a flag on the system that would help.
Would you like to respond? Because that strikes a few chords with me as well, and fundamental to all of this is the democratic accountability and getting the balance right, which I don't think we've got at the moment. So if you could comment on that, I think that would be helpful.
Yes, Chair. So in terms of the issues raised, the first one around an amendment and when it constitutes material enough to go out for consultation, we generally are on the side of caution as planning officers. There may have been a few examples in the past where the officer took a different view, but by and large, officers will err on the side of caution and reconsult, and therefore that safeguard in the proposed arrangements would be effective. I guess on sort of relatively rare occasion it didn't happen. There are still the various safeguards in the Constitution to pick up those occasions. So I'm satisfied that as proposed we'd pick up virtually all of the required things going to committee. The second one around the impact on me, I fully acknowledge that, and I have considered that actually. It's definitely an issue, but I think it'd be relatively rare, and I've discussed with Ms. Coulter around the parameters which I would invoke that clause, and I think we'd have to have an audit trail. I think we'd have to have some rules and regulations beyond what's in the Constitution. I don't think it should be something which should be taken lightly. So I would propose that there would be some supporting guidance for how and when that should occur. And I wouldn't do it without consulting with Ms. Coulter and other sort of senior officers, I think. So I think it would be a sort of relatively exceptional circumstance to avoid it being seen as a route round it. So that's all I would say on that one. Technology is improving all the time. We're slightly held back by our current systems across 3 offices, 3 different planning systems, and we are looking to see what we can do with those in the here and now. And I think it's something which we acknowledge, and we will move to a better, more inclusive future, and we'll do what we can with the current systems, but until we actually take that leap of faith and procure a brand new system which is BCP supported, then we're going to have to sort of use our existing systems as they are best we can at the moment.
Councillor Dunlop.
Thank you, Chairman. Certainly welcome the extension where there are amendments, because I have to confess I've been caught out by that. So that is a welcome one. In terms of the number of objections, I had a look at the 3 websites today in terms of what information is provided to residents if they want to raise an objection. And the pool one, in fact, wasn't too bad. There was, these are the sorts of things that are considered as material. These are the sorts of things that aren't. The Bournemouth one sort of said a few words like that. And nothing was to be found on Christchurch. In fact, I had to sign a disclaimer before I could even get past one screen to look at a planning application. So, yes, I welcome the fact that we are going to reintroduce the number of, putting in objections from residents. But I do feel that it's a minefield for them. And that we need better upfront information. They need to clearly understand what is a material planning objection, because and nobody around this table is under any illusion that most residents are shocked that they can't actually write and complain about something, and if 20 of them write, then we'll listen and we'll do something. It is still a shock to most residents that it doesn't actually work like that. There's this criteria. So I think we do have to be a lot smarter, and we have to get some information on our websites that actually provide the information of what is considered a material planning objection. Thank you.
Councillor Bartlett.
Yeah, the issue of what's material to applications, and we did discuss this at the working group, and it wasn't so much the changes to that occurred during an application process. My concern was those changes that occurred after planning consent had been granted, that were maybe considered to be material by some and maybe by the planning officer not. And how that then generates changes that could potentially go to the heart of the original decision. And I think that there is a weakness in our planning system in this particular area. It's not addressed here, but I do think it does need to be addressed at some time. Thank you.
And I think it's fair to say, Councillor Bartlett, in separate conversations that I've had with Mr. Perrins as recently as today about some other issues which have come up from a residents' association, that this will be a work in progress. So whatever it is that comes forward and gets agreed now, there will be other issues that need to be reviewed. There'll be issues that we haven't considered at all, and other things will emerge over time as the situation changes. And I think we need to do it in that open and transparent way that we're going to have to come back to it again and again periodically. So your point is well made. I expect we've all got similar experiences. Nobody else has indicated. I've got a couple of points I wanted to make. Councillor Brown.
Just wanted to make one quick comment. Actually, it's quite useful to hear the numbers around the number of objections and which would trigger a referral to planning committee. It's useful to hear how many, if it was 10 or 15 or 20. Just wanted to add that I suppose that's at the moment when there isn't a trigger to bring it to planning committee. If there's a known trigger to bring it to planning committee and it's got 15, 16, 17, how many residents' associations are going to quickly go round to a neighbour and say, please get this in, then we'll get over the 20 threshold and it'll come to planning committee. So just a word of caution, if it might add 2 or 3 to each planning committee, if we put that trigger in, that might be 3 or 4 or 5 each planning committee, because there'll be a known trigger and campaigning groups and activists will, I'm sure, try and hit the trigger.
Well, the comment I wanted to make are on that subject, and I think it's. I think our system is very weak. That at the moment there isn't a trigger, and that residents feel that they are not being taken into account, and it can only really get there via a ward councillor, which has its imperfections as well. In fact, because the ward councillor has to be, if you like, leading the charge, and may or may not actually have the same view as the residents. I can only speak on the experience of Bournemouth, where the figure was 10, and it was 10 or more from separate addresses on planning grounds, contrary to the officer's recommendation. So, contrary to the recommendation is pretty key to that. And in my experience, and I served as chair of planning for quite a long time in Bournemouth, I don't recall an instance of residents, if you like, taking advantage of it, or in fact there being an avalanche of such representations. By and large, they were encapsulated by other means, as Mr. Perrins has indicated. But of course, things have changed and things are different in different parts of BCP, I've no doubt. For me, the bar being set at 20 is too high. If it is something of local interest, real local interest, surrounded by residential properties that are not flats, I think in some cases one would struggle to find that many, and it might be a very legitimate set of representations that actually really should result in the application going to planning. I rather favour myself the compromise of 15, because I think 20 is too high a bar in many cases, but I do quite understand that 10 may be far too low for today's circumstances. So my view would be 15. I don't know how much support that would get. And I don't know whether, Mr. Perrins, you would find that a manageable number. Of course, there is always the opportunity to come back and review later on, as I've already expressed. Would you like to comment on that? And then there's a couple of other members who've indicated.
Yes, so from the data we have, 15 appears manageable, 20 more certainly so. But we don't know the effect of, say, Councillor Brown's point about what would actually happen in practice. So I think it would be very much a case of we'll have to try it and see what happens. But 15, based on the statistics we have, it seems like it would work in the here and now.
Thank you. Councillor Brooke.
Thank you, Chair. It's something I've not experienced, and I found that with my particular ward, generally it is led by the councillors once they have been requested to meet with the residents. What I am concerned about in that is the phrase "in the area." What actually does that mean? How far out from the planning application site are we talking about when we're talking about the area? Are we talking about the ward as a whole? Because there could be large parts of that ward which are just not affected by that planning, but we could then have the position of residents in those unaffected areas being encouraged to write in because their friend has asked them, that has been raised. It's woolly, I think, in terms of interpretation. Could it be somewhere outside the ward? And again, a friend is writing in on behalf of someone else. It does leave itself open potentially to abuse. I take your point, you haven't seen any in your experiences, but we are embarking on a new era. And I do have concerns about including this in its entirety. I'm prepared to accept it and trial it and see how it goes, but I'm still wary of the phrase "in the area."
Yeah, I can add some flexion to that.
Ms. Coulter, you wanted to comment?
Just that phrase was taken from actually living, working or studying in the area from the Constitution in relation to other matters, so it would be the BCP area. But I totally take on board your comments, Councillor Brooke, about that potentially being too extensive. It was an attempt to limit it. At least some councils allow objections from anyone nationally. If it's a matter of national interest, then you can register and you can object wherever you live, can't you? So any objection. So it's how you define. So rather than resident, I think there was a view that actually should be, resident living or studying or working in the area was relevant rather than just residents. But actually, that's for you to debate. So you could amend that and you can restrict or extend that as you wish. But there's always going to be, I think, a subjective element to it and some judgment, which the head of planning will have discretion on advice to consider.
On what's just been said.
Yeah, is that okay? My understanding, because I raised this over the two hospital applications, was there was problem with the Bournemouth website. I think you were aware of when it wouldn't allow people who lived outside of Bournemouth, or as it turned out BCP, to make any comment on the hospital. And pools did allow you, could be anywhere in the country. So I think we have to be very careful. I'm not sure that we should be restricting people to our area, because if it's a matter around the hospital or the airport or something like that, something of significance, somebody who lives in Wimborne or Purbeck or Ringwood has as much interest in that as someone who lives in BCP, and I feel very strongly that we shouldn't be restricting that.
Would you like to clarify your comments, Ms. Coulter?
Yes, I think if it was left that it was objected to a proposal without any further caveats, it would be certainly easier to manage. There might be more of an impact when we could review it, but it would be something that's very straightforward and can be dealt with much more easily without the judgment. So yes, that would be absolutely fine.
Councillor Bartlett.
Sorry, no.
Sorry, I thought you indicated again. Councillor Brand.
Thank you, Chair. Just a very quick comment. And it's prompted by something you said yourself about contrary to an officer's recommendation, and actually where it's written in the report here, it is very much from the premise that planning applications will go in and residents will want to object to them and stop them. But we do have the contrary. I recall a planning application in Hamworthy where it is an employment site, and the planning application went in for a supermarket. It was contrary to policy, but the residents really wanted the supermarket, and they were writing in by the truckload to actually support the planning application and wanted it to go ahead contrary to policy. So I think we shouldn't approach it just from the premise that it's going to be residents wanting to object and stop something. They may want something to go to committee because they want it to be pushed through. So we need to cover both of those scenarios. I accept it's predominantly objecting, but it's not always.
And equally, of course, the officer's recommendation might be to refuse, and members of the public have been opposed to the application, so it falls at that first hurdle and it doesn't end up at the planning committee anyway. I think there has to be, doesn't there, an element of invoking the delegation to the head of planning to get this whole thing to work, because it's been referred back in those terms by Ms. Coulter on a number of occasions on this item, and there does have to be a fail-safe mechanism at the end of the road to determine that. So I'm not quite sure, members, how you want to deal with these. We have a whole range of things within the paper itself, and we've heard from the head of planning the consideration about each and every one of those. Are you content to allow those as we've discussed? In terms of the threshold, how shall we deal with that? I think it's Mr. Perrins said that he feels that 15 is manageable, but 10 is not. And we're waiting, of course, as in the final analysis for Ms. Coulter and the legal team to actually draft this in terms that are going to encapsulate all of those principles. How would you propose going about it?
Thank you, Chairman. I think if you looked at the proposals as they're set out in paragraph 19, if one of the members were to move and you had a move on the table, you could move agreement to the proposals subject to amendment to change the threshold from 20 to 15 if that's what members were proposing, and to remove the reference to the area and to make reference to a decision contrary to officer's recommendation, which would pick up representations that are objecting and or supporting an application that's against the officer's recommendations, as was the case in Bournemouth before. We can adjust the wording to incorporate that. I think those are the key points probably that you wanted to pick up.
So would somebody like to make such a move? Councillor Bartlett, are you volunteering?
Yes, I would move what Tanya has just said. Thank you.
How very neatly put. Do you have a seconder?
I would also move that, but I would prefer to stick with 20, personally.
Councillor Bartlett.
So in that case, I've made a move. If somebody wants to second me, I would go along with your view on.
Sorry, your move is what number?
15.
Your move is 15. That's
and
what I
take it from there. And if that fails, then we can move on.
Second that.
So, Councillor Cox, are you making an amendment to that, or are you?
That's right. If that's okay. I prefer to stick with 20 personally.
Do you have a seconder? You would. Right. Well, we'll deal with the amendment first. Anybody want to speak any further on it? Councillor White.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. The only point I'd make is that it's much easier to go down than to go up. If we started at 15 and then decided we wanted to go to 20, that would be quite difficult politically. It might be easier to go the other way.
And the counter-argument might be that it's very much dependent on the area. In some areas it's workable and in some areas it's not workable. So, are you happy we go to a vote on the amendment? All those in favour, please indicate.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6.
And those against?
1, 2, 3.
That now becomes the substantive move on that item, so we'll need to... is there any further debate needed? All right, so on the substantive move, we'll take a vote on that. All those in favour, please indicate.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Thank you. That's unanimous. But like all the other issues around planning, no doubt if we find it necessary to review, either because officers bring it to us or because we feel it needs to be reviewed, then we'll be able to do so in the future. I rather lost track, actually, Councillor Cox. Did your move incorporate all the other items under planning? I took it, I think that it did. All right, so we can now move on to the next item, which was public participation and access. Yes. So the next one on my list is public participation and access. Could you just remind us the issues that we need to determine?
Yes, there is a proposed amended Appendix 6 appended to the report, set out as Appendix B, and then there's a petition scheme set out in Appendix C. So I think the recommendation of the working group was to amend the Constitution in the way set out in Appendix B and to add in the petition scheme at Appendix C. Now that amendment proposed makes changes to the statements and questions. So the number of formal statements at full council should be limited to 4 statements in any one municipal year, as it is for questions at the moment. As it is at the moment, and that the number of questions would be limited to 4 questions in any one municipal year as well. So it brings those 2 things in line. At the moment, there's no restriction on the number of questions. And it also makes amendments to the provision on questions and statements for committees other than council, that it would be limited to items on the agenda for that meeting. And I think that is probably the issue that you may want to debate, Chairman, and come to a view on.
So, members, do you have views? Yeah. Well, apparently we don't, Ms. Coulter. So we must be in agreement. Councillor Slade.
I'm only speaking because I assume somebody else would ask this question and they haven't. And this only applies to full council and not to other meetings of the council. With regard, and obviously the item being a relevant question applies to the other meetings, as far as if you're on health, you can't ask a question about bins, for example, that would be inappropriate. But how does it sit with the constitutional arrangements around statements and petitions to other committees, for example, Cabinet or ONS, on the numbers? Because I believe it's 4 and 4 at full council, but I believe there's no limit at other meetings. And I was just wondering whether that was discussed within the Constitutional Working Party group.
Ms. Coulter.
I can. The proposal in the appendix is that, as Councillor Slade has alluded to, that the restriction to 4 questions and 4 statements is a restriction in relation to full council per year. On the basis that the working group considered that enabling the public to ask questions about issues that were on the agenda was a suitable restriction in that sense, and that it shouldn't be limited to a number per year, because there may well be a number of relevant items coming up on different committees that a member of the public may well want to ask a question or make a statement on. And therefore, I think the working group was of the view that restricting the questions and the statements that could be made at other committees to items on the agenda was the appropriate way of managing that public access. If you as a committee were minded to remove that restriction and allow the public, as they can at the moment, to ask any question at any committee relating to any item of council business not related to the agenda, then you may then have to consider an additional restriction on the number per year, because you would then be potentially in that situation of having questions about a lot of different things that weren't relevant being repeated in various committees around the council.
So are we content on Councillor Brooke?
Sorry, Chair. Just a point, as a member of the ONS board, there was some discussion around items on the agenda, and that felt that because we are looking at ahead, that the public had the right to bring questions to and statements to ONS board that were outside the main agenda, because they could then be taken and put onto the forward plan if it was felt appropriate to do so. On the other hand, you can argue that because the forward plan is on the agenda, then anything that is brought up could relate to the agenda, irrespective of whether it was one of the specific items or not. So I would hope that the ONS board would go along with this as is and be allowed to interpret it in that particular way.
So can we agree with what's proposed on this one? Yes? Excellent. Thank you very much. We passed over meeting dates and times, and Vice Chairman's just reminded me that a comment was made earlier in terms of the issue of the venue, and I think it was something the Chief Executive raised. I think we ought, for completeness, to resolve this one way or another. Chief Executive, could you remind us?
Thanks, Chairman. Yes, it was just the use of the word need. How do you define that we need to move, as opposed to it would be preferable to move? So my view was just to soften it so that members, and particularly the Chairman, could make a decision to locate it anywhere within the BCP area, depending on the subject, rather than having to demonstrate a need to be in a particular location.
Substituting the word need with the word could, or the need to substituted by could be. Does that do it?
Yes, please. Sorry.
Just to come in on that one, I think that's probably my drafting of the report has led to the ambiguity, but paragraphs 20 to 23 set out, in a sense, the working group's views and comments on the full council decision, and it's really guidance. So I think it would be helpful to note in the minutes, as the Chief Executive has said, that the committee is of the view and agreed that the location of the meetings would be dependent upon the decision of that particular committee and at the discretion of that committee, if you wish. Ultimately, that it is. But there was no formal recommendation coming from the working group or from this committee to council in relation to meeting dates and times. It was something that was discussed, but there's no formal recommendation because it has been dealt with already through the item that came to full council at the last meeting. So it doesn't have to form part of your recommendations, but if you wanted that particular point noted in the minutes, then at least it would record that issue.
My sense, Chairman, if you wanted to change the report so it read that way, I think if you just deleted need to, you could say the working group accepted the location meetings will sometimes on an exceptional basis be different from the venue in the calendar, so dependent on the subject being discussed. And effectively, we I think would interpret that as being at the discretion of the chair of the committee. So that's helpful. So just delete need to would probably work.
Are we all happy with that? Mm-hmm. Excellent. The next item was recording votes. Ms. Coulter.
Thank you, Chairman. I think the committee needs to decide whether it, first of all, wants to have a process in place whereby votes can be recorded at committees other than council, and if so, whether every single vote is recorded or whether there's a similar mechanism to that at full council where it's a quarter of the members present can vote for a recorded vote on any particular item where it's controversial or close or for another reason.
Perhaps we'd like to bear in mind how we've dealt with voting this evening at Audit and Governance Committee. Views around the table?
My personal view is that it's too administratively burdensome to record votes at every meeting. I think we've dealt with it very well tonight, and I don't see any reason to change that. That's my personal opinion.
So the threshold of 25% would apply across the board in that case. Is that agreed? I think that's the right way forward. Feels comfortable to me. New terms of reference for audit and governance. Ms. Coulter?
I hope that can be agreed, Chairman. I think this arose, Mr. Stannard might be able to add to this, arose from one of your previous meetings just to update and amend your terms of reference.
Mr. Stannard?
Yeah, you'll recall in November we had an hour and a half session on this, so we the appendix is the reflection of that meeting, and it has been circulated before to members to view.
Can we agree on that? Thank you very much. The interim shadow arrangements, I'm sure we can agree that. And the technical and administrative is left to the monitoring officer. And we're all agreed on that, I'm sure, as well. That then concludes item 12 on the agenda. Councillor Slade?
You won't want me to come again, will you, Chair?
It depends what you're going to say.
I just wondered whether there were scheduled additional meetings of this group, because I know there are outstanding matters and there are things coming in all the time, some of which have only come in the last few days. So I didn't know whether, in conclusion to this item, that there is a plan to continue or whether it will meet if a certain number of issues build up, because I'd like to be able to feed back to members who have concerns about where they might take them next.
Well, we've changed how we formulate the business that we're going to conduct and the number of meetings at which we're going to do it, and as you will see from the forward plan. And my anticipation would be that then gets fed in periodically and added to the forward plan, not on a set basis, as in at every particular interval, but when there is a necessity to do so, which is how we've dealt with other issues that are periodic. Does that answer
So
your
I
question?
wonder whether, well, because the Constitutional Working Group was set up so that members could feed in, if that member group is going to be closed down as a sort of task and finish completion, what the process is for members to feed in, because you use the phrase as we sort of see fit. Well, it's as the member sees fit. If they've got a burning concern, how do they get that into the system, as opposed to how does the committee deal with something that members might be very worried about, and the one that has been burning away is the more than one planning committee question, which goes back to issues that are specifically around the Constitution.
Well, we clearly will need a mechanism for bringing back further consideration of planning issues in any event. Perhaps you could comment, Ms Coulter.
Thank you, Chairman. If you were agreeable to this, or the committee were agreeable, we could advise members that any further comments come in to me or to Mr Hanton to collate, and that we then brief you on at the Chairman's briefing on a monthly basis. As Chair of Audit and Governance Committees, we have got 5 items, and we would be recommending, therefore, that we have a meeting of the working group to consider those and bring them back. So there is that regular collation, so that it is as and when something comes through that's significant. So we're not building in meetings for the sake of them, but that we are able to respond quickly within a month, rather than leaving it for 6 months or something like that. And if you're content with that, Leader and Chairman, we could do it that way.
I have no doubt that we want to keep it live. I think you're pushing an open door, actually, and I think we would all want to keep it live and active when it's needed. Can we agree to that? Excellent. So could I just take us back to the Constitution paper, which is item 12, and the 2 recommendations which we ought to deal with. I think recommendation A is to approve, but as amended. So can we agree to that, please?
Agree.
Thank you very much. And then the second one is the issue of necessary and consequential technical and formatting related updates and revisions to the Constitution to be made by the monitoring officer in accordance with the powers delegated to her. So that's the mopping up of these issues into correct legal language. So I think we can probably agree on that, Ms Coulter.
Thank you, Chairman, and this will be put in as formal recommendations from this committee to Council, and we will then circulate the final amended version to you before it's published for the full Council agenda.
Thank you very much. I suppose we ought to formalise it with a vote. So taking those 2 together, all those in favour, please indicate. That is unanimous. Thank you all very much indeed for taking us through what's quite a complex piece of business and a really important one for the Council. So that I think means that we've discharged that particularly well. So moving on to item 13, risk management, corporate risk register update, and that is for you, Mr Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so this is the quarterly update. You receive this at every main committee of Audit and Governance. A very extensive review this quarter by corporate management team and service directors. In the exec summary, you'll see the dynamic nature of how that risk register moves. Corporate risk 8 in particular, you'll see was around the running of an election, general election. Obviously that's come in the quarter and been removed in the quarter because that risk is obviously gone. And the other key feature is the corporate risk 11, which the Chief Executive may wish to comment on. It's the extent to which members and officers are able to fully engage with new roles and operating efficiently. So that's been added to the risk register, this with the Chief Executive as the main risk owner of that one.
Do you wish to comment, Chief Executive?
I'm happy, Chairman. It's relatively self-explanatory. It is a new council. It is a much bigger scale than the old council. We have a large number of new members and a large number of new officers, and I guess I'll just repeat that not one of us has been in our current role for more than about 9 months. So I think there is an inherent risk. I think we should recognise that. I'm hoping we have that risk fully mitigated and well under control, but I think it is a significant potential risk.
Thank you.
I don't think it was articulated in that way. That it was articulated at all, actually.
I'm happy to take any other questions, Chair.
Members, Councillor Bartlett.
Yeah, on the service development, looking at the way the risk management is going to be managed throughout the council, is there a project plan associated with that development?
Yes, we are. Sorry. Yes, Councillor Bartlett. We're using the programme officer Matt Rabbit approach is helping us to make sure that that's a structured approach. And we're operating a project management approach to make sure that that's done properly.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, we're asked to note the report. Are you agreed we should note?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Stannard. Takes us on to item 14 on the agenda. My apologies to Mr. Dossett and Ms. Harding for keeping you waiting for so long until we got to your items. So the first of your two items at item 14 is the External Audit Progress Report, including certification of grant claims for legacy councils. Do I take it that Mr. Dossett is going to commence, or?
I'll start with this one briefly, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Harding.
So this is our progress report that just sort of updates you on the work that we've carried out sort of since the last audit committee. Obviously, it's quite quiet time really as far as the accounts go, and we started our planning of the 1920 audit. The main focus of our work over the autumn is certification of grant claims. Those are the housing benefit claims, teachers' pensions and pooling capital receipts, which we had to undertake for all of the legacy councils. Our progress report sort of sets out our findings in respect of those grant claims, and I probably wasn't going to go through them in any more detail, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions from members? No, there are no questions.
That's fine. And the rest of our report really is just our regular update of things that you may find of interest to look at. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We're asked to note the report. Are you happy that we note the external auditor's progress to date? Is that agreed? Thank you very much. That takes us on to item 15, which is the external audit fee letter 2019-20. Is this you, Mr. Dossett? Thank you.
You may recall from the 18-19 audit of the predecessor bodies that we discussed, I think, at the October audit committee meeting, additional fees at the end of those audits. And in discussions with PSAA, they reflected a very strong desire for from the local authority sector that the auditors would look to plan any additional work they needed to do up front and include it as part of their planning process rather than as a process at the end. So what we have done is that in terms of the fee letter, which obviously is quite detailed and reflects the context in which we're currently auditing, the additional fees proposed have two elements really. One is a generic element that applies to effectively all councils of a similar size, what's called the Category 2 councils, which are councils who have a turnover above 500 million. So the numbers in respect of that are very generic, and they apply. That we are seeking to apply those to all councils of a similar size. And then there's a specific additional part that relates to the fact it's the first year of BCP, and there's a lot of additional balances and opening balances and things like that to test. So the plan would be that the specific bit would be a one-off potential cost, as just in respect of 1920. So the fee proposal we have in our letter is subject, like all of the things in the PSAA world, subject to approval from PSAA in due course. So I'll leave it there and obviously happy to take any questions that members have.
Questions, members? Councillor Cox?
I'm not familiar with the PSA, but do they do a comparison over a number of different firms of auditors?
They do. They have quite a detailed process of comparing in the breakdown of categories between auditors and between different bodies. So they will, for example, and I'm not kidding you, if any of our sub fees are £500 different to a similar sized council, let's just say Brighton or Southampton, for example, they will come up and say, why is it £500 different for a particular sub item? So they do a lot of detailed comparison. To put it, just to give you some, if the 18-19 audit, we still have about 20 or so audits that they're still doing their comparison work with in respect of 18-19 additional fees. So they do go into it with some detail.
Well, if there are no further questions, we're asked to note the external auditor's proposed annual fee for 2019-20 as set out in the attached letter. I think I will take a vote on this one. All those in favour, please indicate. Thank you very much. Takes us on to the final item on the agenda at 16, which is the forward plan for 2019-20. And it is set out in the Appendix A. I just had a couple of comments to make, just to help us through the process. And you'll note that the next two meetings of Audit and Governance are for presentations. The way we've structured this, as members will know, is that we've introduced periodic additional meetings to get presentations on issues that members would like to know more about, would like to be able to question officers and so on, in addition to the meetings which contain the more regular work, such as this evening's. So the next of those is on the 20th of February, when we're proposing to deal with the issue of the relationship between the general fund and the housing revenue account, which I think will be a presentation by Mr. Richards and his team, I believe. Mr. Richards is looking baffled. It is obviously members of your team, Mr. Richards, but it's a financial paper and it's about understanding better. And I think a number of members had asked that we got a better understanding of what that relationship between general fund and the housing revenue account is. And so we're hoping to do that on the 20th of February. And then on the 12th of March, I think a little bit has got lost in translation in terms of how that is titled on the forward plan, and needs to be reworded. So the intention of the wording was about the management of sustainable procurement aligned with the Council's environmental objectives. And I think that probably explains it slightly better than the wording that's actually on the forward plan itself. So that's about getting a better understanding of sustainable procurement, but around what those priorities for the Council are in terms of its environmental objectives. And that's the one that's taking place on the 12th of March. And then, if you like, a regular meeting of Audit and Governance will be the one on the 30th of April. And you'll see from that the regular items that we would be expecting to see on our agenda. I think the only other thing to add on that was that I think officers are looking at the location of some of the meetings that you may already have in your diaries. One or two of those may need to be reviewed and we'll await that information coming back from the officers in due course. I have one other item on the forward plan, but just before I get to that, does that sound like the kind of forward plan that we were envisaging? And perhaps more importantly, as I said at the last meeting, if you've got other items you'd like to bring forward for the additional meetings for the future, please could you let me and the Vice Chairman know? Because I don't want them to be last minute. I want them to be properly worked up and to be representative of what members of Audit and Governance actually want to be seeing in terms of presentation to widen that knowledge. And alongside that, I think I gave an undertaking that I would further research what opportunities were available for training through the Local Government Association for members of Audit and Governance, because it is a topic area that the LGA are now putting some resource into, and it would seem appropriate that we take advantage of it for those members who would like to. Councillor Cox.
Request, really. I wasn't able to attend the Treasury Management, I think, training session, and I just wondered if I could get the slides sent to me.
I've certainly had them. They didn't just go to members who were. Yeah, I think you'll find they've been sent to you. Yes. So if we can agree on the forward plan around the items that I've just outlined, there is one other item for the forward plan which I think the Chief Executive was going to speak on, which is around the item from Audit and Governance on the 10th of October last year concerning the Kinston Community Association and how we're going to deal with that issue as well. Chief Executive.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yes, we have received a response from Kinston Community Association trustees. Unfortunately, that came in just a bit too late to write a paper for this meeting, but fortunately early enough that we didn't produce a paper saying that we hadn't had a response. We need a few weeks just to pick that up, and what I'm suggesting is that we'll bring that to the first audit committee that we can. So we just need to assimilate that, talk back, answer some questions, and then we'll bring a report through to the first audit committee that's available, which is why, if, with your agreement, I'd like to use whichever of the types of meeting it is, so we can bring that and try and close it down, rather than just bringing it to the next quarterly one, if that works for you.
So that's probably either the 20th of February or the 12th of March, from what you're saying.
I would think the March one is more likely, just to give us time to follow it through.
Correct. Thank you very much. Members, that brings us to the end of our agenda. Could I say thank you all very much indeed for sticking with it, both members and officers, without a break. I'm pleased that we've managed to do it before, with a conclusion before 9 o'clock, and I therefore close this meeting at 8:52. Thank you all very much.